evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the grand final of the New Zealand Initiative's Next Generation debates. My name is Oliver Hartwig and I'm the Executive Director of the initiative. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the Friedlander Foundation for the very generous support for this project. Michael Friedlander has been a long-standing supporter of many projects designed to improve public understanding of public policy. Without his support, this tournament wouldn't have happened. The aim of the tournament is to get people, especially young people, thinking and talking about public policy issues and understanding why they matter. That's indeed the initiative's mission, promoting sound public policies that will make for a better standard of living for all New Zealanders. To give you a background to tonight's event, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about how the Next Generation debates work. The debate tonight is the culmination of 6 preliminary debates and 2 hard-fought semi-finals last week. The topics have ranged from subjects such as progressive tax rates are unfair to should New Zealand tie MPs and ministers' salaries to a multiple of the national income. University debating teams consisting of 2 of the top debaters from Auckland, Victoria, Canterbury and Otago universities entered the tournament. The mood for tonight is, this House believes that commemorations of past wars are nationalistic exercises in war glorification. I should hasten to explain that the position reflected in the mood is designed to make for a good debate and does not necessarily reflect the view of the New Zealand Initiative. I should also say that teams were assigned their sides of the debate with a toss of a coin. Before we begin, some quick introductions. From Auckland University, arguing the affirmative side, we have Paul Smith. Paul completed a BA in History, Politics and Philosophy at Victoria University and is currently a master's student at the University of Auckland. In New Zealand, he won the New Zealand Impromptu Champs in 2011 and he was a finalist in 2013. He's twice been a finalist in the New Zealand Prepared Champs and was the best speaker of that tournament in 2011. He also won the New Zealand British Parliamentary Champs in 2009. He's joined by James Penn. James Penn is a second-year student at the University of Auckland studying law and commerce, majoring in economics and finance. Since entering the university, he has broken to the semi-finals of the New Zealand Impromptu and New Zealand Prepared Debating Championships. And in 2013, he broke in 8th place at the Australasian InterVarsity Debating Championships. Please welcome Auckland University. And from Canterbury University, arguing the negative side, we have Tim Bain. Tim is the current Vice President of the University of Canterbury Debating Society and the President of the Canterbury Schools Debating Council. At university, he has represented the University of Canterbury at a dozen national and international tournaments. He's also the current holder of the Russell McVeigh Trophy for the most promising speaker and the William Chisholm Memorial Trophy, both of which he won at the New Zealand University's Impromptu Debating Championships. He's joined by Tom O'Brien. And Tom is a 5th-year student of law and history at the University of Canterbury. Current president of the New Zealand University's Debating Council, Tom recently attended the World Universities Debating Championships, where his team broke 6th. He was also ranked as one of the top 25 speakers at the tournament and was a highly commended speaker at the Impromptu Easters Debating Championships. Finally, our adjudicators for tonight are Polly Higby, a solicitor at Duncan Cotterell, Sebastian Templeton, solicitor at Chapman Tripp, and Richard Duff, policy analyst at the Ministry of Education. Again, tonight's mood is, this House believes that the commemorations of past wars are nationalistic exercise in war glorification. The teams have 7 minutes each, and then the replies are 4 minutes each, and starting it for the affirmative is Auckland's James Penn.
On their website, the Australian Government and Army provide suggestions for Anzac Day speeches. In the dawn service suggestion, the first line of one of these suggested speeches is that the purpose of the commemoration is to honour the heroism, tenacity and resilience of that group of young men that fought for the country. After stating the number of the hundreds of thousands of people that died in that effort, the first comment that this suggested speech offers is that news of these casualties, far from weakening this country's resolve at that time, actually served to strengthen it, for the recruiting rate increased. If that is not a glorification of war, the proposition does not know what is. That is a speech which says to the people before it that that war was won and that the lives lost were ones which ultimately were in the interests of the country, which were not sad lives to be lost, but rather honourable lives to be lost, that the casualties were laudable rather than regrettable. We regret that, and we say it is a glorification of that war effort on the whole and wars more generally. Before turning to the case the proposition we'll give you today, it's important to clarify where this debate should, the basis on which this debate should proceed. When we talk about commemorations of war, we're talking about official and semi-official ceremonies, like Anzac Day dawn services, for example. And additionally, we would say that these occur both in a physical sense and also in print. So often we're talking about obituaries towards soldiers that died in these wars, or letters to the paper and celebrations of the war within newspapers and on other media in that sense. When we say that these are nationalistic, we're saying that they have a tendency to focus on the particular nation in which these ceremonies are occurring. So dawn services, for example, focusing on the laudability of the New Zealand effort in the war, rather than looking at the war and the stakeholders that were involved in it more generally. And finally, in terms of glorification, this is in terms of what we have to prove in order to prove that these ceremonies constitute glorification. We would say, in the most simplest sense, we have to prove that these ceremonies contribute to an overall perception of the war and wars in general as more positive than negative elements of a country's history. Importantly, we do not have to prove that these ceremonies cause that to be an in general belief that is held by people in that country, but rather we have to prove that within that specific ceremony, the effect is moving more towards that belief as a result of that ceremony. So, for example, in the case of the Iraq War, it may be the case that there's a general perception in America that that was a bad war and not a laudable war, but in that specific ceremony about celebrating and commemorating the Iraq War and veterans within it, that ceremony contributes to a perception that it was a positive element of their history. To turn to the case that we will advance, first, that these commemorations turn elements of death and loss that are necessary within war into laudable acts of heroism and sacrifice. Second, that these commemorations cause a simplification of the justifications of war and that leads to glorification. And finally, that they shut down critiques of war that are justified and indeed necessary for a state. To the first of those points. We would say that death is the most significant and regrettable result of war. And that is the general opinion held by most people when they turn to war and examine war in isolation. We would say commemorations, because of their nature of bringing a large group of people together that are often instinctively saddened by the fact that that loss of life occurs, try to turn that into a positive fact. So they generally focus not on the sadness and loss of these lives, but as I indicated in my introduction, virtuous values, using language such as bravery, such as heroism, sacrifice, talking about the selfless acts of soldiers rather than the regrettable results of those acts, i.e. the fact that hundreds of thousands of boys did not grow up with a father who didn't come home from war. This means when people turn to consider wars, their first reaction is to consider those values, that when they are standing there in the moment of that ceremony, they are caught up in these ideas of bravery and heroism. And instead of focusing on the sadness and regrettable aspects of war, they focus on the beneficial aspects of war. They focus on the heroism that it represents, on the heroism that those individuals that went to war showed. The opposition may say that this prompts an acknowledgement of loss, but it is always couched in a way that says it was necessary and that these were the brave few people willing to undertake this necessary and beneficial act in a country's history. Finally, we would say that it does this in a shockingly nationalistic way. The focus is always on the sacrifice of that country in which the ceremony is occurring. Take, for example, that speech suggested by the Australian government. The focus there, when they talked about the loss of life, they did not talk about the loss of life in the war effort as a whole, but only the loss of life in that particular country. We would say that is regrettable and that it only considers the effect of war in an isolated sense. As citizens of the world, we should be considering it in a broader sense, regretting the war because of the wider nature and the wider loss that war creates, rather than simply because it was justified because our country only lost this many people and we got this particular gain. Turning to the second point, that this causes a simplification of the justification of wars. The nature of these ceremonies is often that they are relatively brief and that they are very emotional. As a result of this, it becomes very hard to talk about the details of war and the more intricate justifications that cause that war sometimes being necessary. What that means is that the commemorations and celebration turn towards simplified terms. Terms like, and justifications. Justifications like freedom, like fighting for our rights, like fighting against the forces of evil in this world. These are the types of things which are very easy to essentially catch all of those justifications in a commemoration and make it seem like a positive thing, and also alleviate the natural emotion that may occur on the part of some people going to that commemoration. What that means is that these terms are very hard to argue against because they're so generalised and they are catch-all justifications. It's very hard to say that fighting for our freedom was not a good thing because you can't quantify that, you can't argue against it on a detailed level. But moreover, it becomes very easy to transfer those values over to how we consider wars in general. These are often ritualistic ceremonies, and subconsciously we transfer those justifications over to how we see other wars. So wars may in some cases be justified, and in other cases not. The nature of these commemorations is it builds up a narrative about war in general that makes us feel as though it is justified. Ultimately, these commemorations say to people that you are not patriotic, that you are someone who is disrespecting the lives of the soldiers that are lost. If you try and critique that war, we would say that's harmful. Paul will talk more about that. Ultimately, these are commemorations which focus on the positive natures of war, and in doing so, leave their audiences with a positive perception in that moment we are proud to propose.
I'm sure that many of you have attended dawn services, and I'm sure that, much like those I've been to, the words of the Ode of Remembrance echoed with you, right? You know, they shall not grow old as we who are left grow old, age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. And loath as I am to quote poetry in a debate, the words of the Ode of Remembrance, along with many others spoken at Anzac Day, the solemn tune of the last post, these are not songs that we play, or music that we listen to, or odes that we read, to embrace warmongering, to embrace nationalism. They don't send out glory to people who attend dawn services. They don't suggest that war is admirable or beautiful in the way that the popular media often does. What we say these send messages is that it was tragic that people lost their lives at the Somme, at Passchendaele, and on the slopes of Canterbury. It means that we can meet at Gallipoli with people who are Turkish, who were once our enemies, and note that together we suffered horrifically in war. We're proud to stand on side negative and say that commemorating war is not about glorifying it. It's about recognising what war costs us. It's not all about the causes that James wanted to say it was. It's about individuals, it's about people who lose their lives. It's about those kids who grow up without fathers, and that's why it's important to commemorate. I'm going to bring you two substantive points in this debate. First, I want to talk about the context, because it's important to think about how we engage with wars in general, because the alternative we're going to posit isn't the intellectual discussion that James wanted to pretend that it is. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why exactly it is that commemorations fight glorifying and nationalistic conceptions of war, and why they actually mean that we avoid war. James brought you 2 points, right, in terms of rebuttal. He said, firstly, that it suggests casualties and death are laudable, and secondly, it doesn't create this intricate discussion. I'll deal with the second in my substantive, but first let's deal with this idea that it shows these people as heroes, right? Because we say that people who died in war were brave or courageous, and so that naturally endorses war. 2 responses. Firstly, we're going to show you why that is substantively not true, that we do depict people in that way. And I've already given you some examples, right? We stand at Gallipoli alongside the Turkish Prime Minister and President and mourn our shared losses, right? And Angela Merkel laid a wreath at the grave of the unknown soldier in France, despite the fact that they fought against Germany in that war. The Ataturk Memorial in Wellington itself stands as testament to the fact that we celebrate, or rather denigrate, the loss of soldiers regardless of their sides when we look at past conflicts. But secondly, we say that when we as a community send young men and women to war, we owe a bit of a duty to them to recognise that what they did was incredibly brave. These were young men and women who were in many cases drafted or else pressured substantially by their communities at the time to go to war, right? They had to hold guns and kill people. They had to commit horrific acts because we demanded it of them. And yes, we recognise that that's horrific, but we also think that we can commemorate the bravery and courage that is inherent in what those individuals do without embracing a glorious view of war as a whole. A good example of that is Vietnam, which New Zealand would love to forget we ever participated in, right? We would love, as a collective, to forget we engaged in the Vietnam War because it was atrocious and appalling. But at the same time, we have to recognise that the soldiers we sent to die there were themselves brave and courageous. We don't think there's a conflict there. We think that that's perfectly fine. So, how do we engage with wars in cultural memory? We think that the reality is not what James wanted to paint, which is an intellectual discourse about war. We think the alternative is the painting that the media, the portrait that the media paints, rather. In terms of popular media, we say that it's prolific glorification of war. If you look at a movie like *Inglourious Basterds*, if any of you are Tarantino fans, the way that it depicts scalping of unarmed soldiers, a war crime, as being something to laugh about or to find positive and funny and engaging, is exactly the kind of narratives that currently exist in our media. That's how we view war without commemoration, is we view it as something that's not serious, or, in many cases, glorious. We view it nationalistically. You look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, everyone has to pick a side, right? Either Israel are the good guys defending their sovereignty, or Hamas are freedom fighters, right? Guess what? They're both evil, they're both horrific, but we're unwilling to buy into that because we think that you have to glorify one side. You have to have the good guys and the bad guys. The reason that context is important is because it shapes the way that commemorations affect that narrative. Because like James said, the question isn't, is there a bit of nationalism, is there a bit of glorification, but rather how it shapes the narrative. And the reality is that the narrative is incredibly glorifying. The narrative is that we embrace war because these high-flung ideals, the idea of nations warring against each other, the stuff that James wanted to talk about, it's really easy to play good guys and bad guys. It's really easy to see like heroes and villains. What we say is better is what we bring in commemorations, because commemorations are different in three ways, right? We think that they bring firstly a somber tone. The fact that we all know the Ode of Remembrance, and we all know the music of the Last Post. These aren't happy, embracing, glorifying songs, right? It's a somber tone. There's a reason that the vast majority of Anzac services are held at either cemeteries or obelisks or mausoleums. These are statues erected for the dead, right? We are recognising that people have lost their lives in horrific circumstances, and we think that that's negative. But we secondly think there's an individual focus, and we think that's really important, because we think that when we think about individuals, it shapes the narrative in a way that's unique. And that's what I want to talk about now, my second point, as to why that actually helps us fight glorifying and nationalistic narratives. The tone is pretty easy, right? Because if you have a somber tone where we are saddened by the loss of people's lives, like James said, death's a pretty serious thing. So we think that if we're standing there, hearing about people, how people have lost their lives, hearing about how their lives have been destroyed, hearing about how kids have grown up without mothers and fathers, we think that that's generally a pretty somber, empathetic experience. It's not one that makes us think war is awesome, like, Black Hawk Down, mate. It's something that makes us think that war is horrific. It makes us recognise what we've lost. But that's strengthened by the individualistic elements that inevitably come with commemorations. And that's how they work, right? There's a reason that in chapels and churches around New Zealand, we have the names of fallen soldiers from those towns scrawled on the walls of the chapels. There's reasons that obelisks contain the names of the fallen. There's a reason that the Bridge of Remembrance in Christchurch is covered with the Canterbury regiments that fell in the First and Second World Wars. Because commemorations are about individuals. They're not about big collective movements. They're about the human cost. And that not only lets every person who sits there at a dawn service recognise the real cost of war, but it also means that we're able to humanise our enemies. Because instead of the media's depiction of them as barbarians or enemies, instead of just viewing the First World War as a conflict between nation-states that we were on one side of, we can actually see the Turkish man who held Çanakkale and was gunned down by Anzac soldiers. We can sympathise with them and empathise with them and recognise that they, much like us, lost a lot in war. All of that fights the glorifying and nationalistic narratives that side was so scared of. All of this shows us that war is not a pleasure cruise. War is hell, war is horrific, and war bears a cost for all of us. That's a message we can only get if we forget about lofty causes and think about the people who lost their lives. Yes, they were brave, and by God we regret their deaths, but we should definitely, absolutely commemorate them.
If I stood before you at dawn on Anzac Day and told you not of the brave and heroic efforts on the beaches of Gallipoli, but of the fact that New Zealand soldiers, some of whom died on those beaches, were involved in a riot in 1915. A riot which killed Egyptian prostitutes and which destroyed a large part of Cairo. A riot that was driven by drunkenness and racism. You'd boo me off the stage, because it doesn't fit with the image of what we're meant to believe about our soldiers at Gallipoli. You'd boo me off the stage because I'd seem unpatriotic. I'd seem like I was digging up ghosts and I was undermining the very idea that this was a war that was justified. And that's our point. Our point isn't that the commemoration is some kind of war as a pleasure show. Look at our slides of Egyptian beaches, go and have fun. The point is that war in a different and more subtle way that commemorations glorify war in a different and more subtle way. Because they make the concepts associated with war, concepts like it's justified, concepts like it's noble and it's necessary. And when we want to say things like World War I should never have been fought in the first place, World War I is about the territorial ambitions of people at the top and the aristocratic interests of people who wanted to get rich and stay rich, and English people who wanted to preserve a crumbling empire, that doesn't fit with the commemoration itself. Because we can't say that. We can only say that it was necessary and that it was noble, and that's glorification in a more subtle way. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. I'm going to clarify this idea of glorification and show you why we would never deny that there is elements of regret and a somber tone in a commemoration, but those are channeled in such a way as to insulate the war from criticism, to glorify the idea that these young rascals we know became great friends and fought for freedom. We tell you that's a more subtle form of glorification they never engaged with. And then I'll look at their ideas of counter-narratives, and finally look at how the kind of commemoration complex and the cultural forces stop people talking seriously about war. So we told you that glorification isn't obvious or overt. It's not a case that you go along there and the army stands out with a bunch of enrollment forms, but it's about how commemorations shape how we understand war, how in print, when you read the newspapers and they're portrayed around the centenaries, and how from 5 years old people are taken along to dawn parades. They told you it's about regret and about remembrance. It's not to embrace warmongering. The point is, the regret and the remembrance is done in such a way that it's channeled into the subtle glorification of war. They tell you it's about what we've lost, and there's a somber tone. Exactly. But it's about what we had to have lost, according to the commemoration. It's about the fact that we had to go to war in 1914 to protect freedom. We told you in all of our points that kind of sentiment makes people have a particular vision of warfare. That yes, it's regrettable that we have to go to war, but ultimately it's a glorious and noble sacrifice. Why is that the case? And why can't we just change it? Because counter-narratives don't fit into that. Because in order to be able to call it a sacrifice, in order to be able to say, look, my grandfather died on the fields for New Zealand, we can't say that he died pointlessly. We can't say that he died protecting the interests of a crumbling British Empire. We have to say that he died for a noble cause. And that glorifies fighting in wars. That glorifies going to war. That doesn't mean that the next day we go, guys, time to invade Fiji. It means that people, when they think about wars, think of it as being a noble action and a sacrificial action, rather than something that's quite often pointless, rather than something that's quite often intended to help the narrow interests of a richer class than it is to actually defend freedoms. So we told you that you have to justify the sacrifices when you call them noble, and that means you can only ever glorify war. You have to give a reason for people's deaths, and that means you can only ever do it. But secondly, we told you the way that you talk about the conduct during war, when you talk about soldiers as brave, as resilient, as honourable, as loyal, as patriots, and as heroic, means that these ideas and concepts get attached to the idea of fighting a war. And when you have a vision of going to war, you don't, like given to you by a commemoration, you don't think of the riots in Cairo, the fact that many of our soldiers got drunk and murdered prostitutes. You think of how great they all were, how they were all so brave to die on those beaches and huddle in those trenches. Where at that point you get a perception of the conduct which glorifies the fighting of a war. It seems like, although it's regrettable and although we shouldn't have to go to war, if we have to go to war, it's something great for a nation to do. So we told you that all of these kind of concepts exist in commemorations, which perpetuate them amongst people who go to those commemorations. But furthermore, you can't simultaneously say it was a noble sacrifice and that they were super brave, but also say that there were bad things we did during war and they weren't necessarily that heroic, and also say that the war itself was pointless. And at that point, we think the best argument they came up with helps us. It's about Vietnam. America has tremendous problems commemorating Vietnam. Vietnam War veterans have been fighting to be commemorated in the same way as First World War veterans have, because people find it so hard standing up and saying they made a noble sacrifice. Because nobody thinks that. Everybody thinks that America was defending its own narrow interests in the war on communism, and at that point it's hard to say these were noble soldiers who sacrificed a lot for our families and for our freedom, because nobody believes that. So at that point we often don't commemorate Vietnam. In America they often don't commemorate the fact they lost tens of thousands of soldiers because they find it so uncomfortable doing so. And that's because you can't glorify Vietnam, so that flows through into that. So we're telling you that it's not about basically enlisting people for a new war in a new part of the world, but it's about those subtle cultural forces, which mean that the only way you can commemorate are the ways in which they kind of recognise that people's noble sacrifices happened and people were brave. So at that point we think, not only is it, we think it's involved in glorification, and all of their responses about people regretting war are basically true in the sense that that does happen, but we argue that it's channeled through this idea that war is necessary in some way, which also glorifies the act of going to war. It's the last stand, it's the last step, it's a thing you've got to do sometimes, and it sucks that you've got to do it, but you really have to, and that's glorification as well, because quite often you don't have to go to war. The United States didn't have to invade Vietnam, and that's why they find it hard to make that narrative stick. We didn't have to go to war in 1914 to protect England's crumbling empire and all those sorts of things, so we think that that's glorification there. Let's talk about counter-narratives. They said, well look, sometimes films like Inglourious Basterds are released which glorify war. Yeah, there's lots of stuff which does glorify war more than commemorations do. It doesn't mean that commemorations don't glorify war and don't silence critique in that way. But secondly, there's hundreds of films on the other side of it. So we think there's lots of films on either side which doesn't mean a thing to do with commemorations. But secondly, if you still want to drag them into this, we think that the way commemorations work sets the tone, it sets the narrative, so it enables films like that to go even further, because we can't criticise wars necessarily in terms of their justification. So we end up believing things like our soldiers are noble and they're fighting for a good cause. And when we start to believe that, we start to believe it's okay to torture people in Inglourious Basterds. If that's their case, that's what people start to think if they watch it, because they were fighting for a noble cause. And we can't question that cause because on the anniversary of World War I, we will have a huge media and a huge set of commemorations that tell us that it was justified. We can't criticise it. Finally, we told you it silences critique. For the very same reason I couldn't stand up at Anzac Day and say what I've said about the facts of war and about the conduct of our soldiers in certain areas, it makes it harder and harder to say that war isn't regrettable but necessary sometimes. It makes it harder and harder to say that war is dirty and everybody commits crimes and everybody's horrible, because you can't say that. You can't say those soldiers in graves are horrible because it's a commemoration and you're forced to say that they're okay. And so we believe on those grounds that it's a subtle form of glorification, and we believe we've won this debate.
The other question at the end of Paul's speech is that war commemorations are always about providing narratives about why the losses were justified because the war absolutely had to be won. Because we were fighting on the right side for freedom and for values that we still stand for today. Why is it that Angela Merkel could visit the tomb of the unknown soldier and lay a wreath there at the foot of enemies who fought against her country in World War I, in World War II, and for hundreds of years beforehand? Why is it that the Prime Ministers of New Zealand and of Turkey can stand at Anzac Cove and commemorate the losses of their soldiers when those soldiers were fighting against each other? Because if nationalism was the focus of war commemorations, then what the hell were they going to do? Was the New Zealand Prime Minister going to stand up and give a speech about how our boys sacrificed for a noble cause? And then was the Prime Minister of Turkey going to stand up and give the opposite speech again? How well do we think that would have gone down? The fact of the matter is that war commemorations are about recognizing the individuals who gave their lives in conflicts, whether or not those conflicts were justified because their community told them to or because they were forced to do it. We can recognize the sorrow of their loss. We can honor their memory and their sacrifice without having to say, all war is awesome, we're always the good guys, and damn those evil other people who used to oppose us. That's the distinction that they've never been able to engage with, and that's the reason that their case falls down. Two questions in this debate. What is the focus of war commemorations? Is it on nationalism and justifying every war we've ever fought, or is it about honoring and recognizing individual loss? And the second question is, how do war commemorations affect narrative about conflict and collective memories? Right, this first issue. What we've heard from them is that when you go to a war commemoration, you absorb this narrative that every loss that was suffered there was justified because it was fighting for the right side, it was fighting for a just cause, and then that subtly therefore changes your ideas about war and about opposition. And there are basically three areas where that falls down. The first is this idea that war commemorations have to be inherently nationalistic, and I've already pointed out the absurdity of that statement, because if that was what war commemorations were about, we couldn't have joint ceremonies at Anzac Cove. We couldn't have leaders from other countries visiting the shrines of the war shrines of opponents from previous wars, because that simply wouldn't be acceptable in a nationalistic context if that was the narrative we're pushing. What we have told you down the line, and what is a far more realistic narrative about what these commemorations are actually about, is that they are about honouring the individuals who did sacrifice their lives in that war, whether or not that war was inherently justified. And that's why the focus of them is all about loss, and that's also something, as a second area rather, where they haven't been able to engage with it. Because the last post is not a cheerful, jaunty tune. We don't celebrate, you wouldn't listen to it when you were marching into battle. The Ode to Remembrance isn't a saga about how awesome our soldiers were and how evil the enemies that they fought against were. When we go to a dawn service, we don't read out lists of our military victories, lists of our conquests, and casualty numbers from enemies. We read out the names of the fallen, because it is the fallen that are the centerpiece of these ceremonies, and it is our common loss, and at both an individual and a collective level, that is the focus. And that's why people from different nations can go to each other's dawn ceremonies, or go to each other's equivalents in other nations, because that sense of loss and sorrow about the tragedy of war is a narrative that transcends nationalism, and a narrative that attaches to everyone. That's why you have family members wearing the uniforms or carrying souvenirs of the soldiers of their fathers or grandfathers who went away to war and never came back. Because they recognize that loss, they recognize that sorrow, and that's a moment for people who have also suffered that sorrow to share in that and to share in that commonality, and to realize that what has happened is that we've all shared loss for horrific reasons, but with good people. And this is the third reason where it falls down, because they tried to say if you honor soldiers, you have to say that their deaths were meaningful, that they died for a reason, that therefore the war was just, that therefore all wars are just. And I think as I say that to you, you can realize the tenuousness of each link in that logical chain. But the problem is, at a fundamental level, is that it is perfectly consistent for a New Zealander to say, I oppose the Vietnam War, as most New Zealanders do, but also to say that those soldiers who were forced by social pressures or by actual physical coercive pressure to fight in that war were still heroes, because they did do something that was brave. They did put their lives on the line. And the fact that the community failed them and the community sent them to fight an unjust war and then failed to support them actually reinforces their heroism and reinforces the nobility of their sacrifice. Because they did something even though the outcome was meaningless or was indeed harmful, they still did something that was brave. They put their lives on the line because the community asked them to, and that's something that we can honour. Because if we accepted that kind of narrative that we had from them, then there would never be criticism about the Vietnam War or World War I. And sure, you might not stand up at a dawn ceremony and say, oh yes, but World War I was really about the capitalistic classes who wanted to oppress the workers across various regions, and they decided they want to have these kind of conflicts. Because in the same way that you wouldn't stand up at Bill Clinton's funeral and discuss Monica Lewinsky. Because you don't have to denigrate soldiers in order to make political points. And the fact that Bill Clinton would have a funeral and people would say nice things about the things he did as president doesn't then mean that people won't criticize him for all the stupid mistakes that he made, or all the horrific things that he did do in his term. War memorials are not about justifying war, they're about focusing on individual loss, about family loss, and about the shared tragedy of war. And that's true whether or not whether the wars we fought in them were justified or not. And that leads on to this, that really determines the way that the second question falls down, about how they affect narratives. Because that personalization of the tragedy of war, that idea about telling stories about soldiers and not about battles, about focusing on the graveyards left behind by conflicts and not on the battlefields and not on the heroic victories, is something that is unique to war commemorations that you don't get in popular media. You don't get movies about graveyards where all we do is sit there and tell personal stories about it, because that's not fun, that's not exciting, there aren't any explosions in that. You get movies like Inglourious Bastards, like Pearl Harbor, which send narratives about war, about how evil the enemy was, about how just our cause was, and about how heroic our soldiers were. They also don't talk about the Cairo riots. They also don't talk about that kind of exploitation or those kind of negative things that came out of war. But you never are going to get a situation in those movies where you could have a Turk and a New Zealander and an Australian sitting together and celebrating their joint tragedy, their joint loss. That is something you do get with war commemorations, because they personalise the tragedy of war, and they do it in a way that transcends national boundaries and allow us to all recognise that while wars may be inevitable, they aren't a great thing.
War is pretty dreadful, and we're pretty happy to stay on side negative, that on the whole we would rather that there were fewer wars in the world. We would rather that when John Key said, let's invade Fiji, the New Zealand public said, well, maybe we should hang back, John. That's a world that we would prefer to live in. The difference between us and these guys is that we don't think that that world is mutually exclusive with one that we recognise, that soldiers, who were in many cases compelled to fight, and in other cases pressured to fight, who were told by their communities at the time that the right thing to do was for them to enlist and go to war, to sacrifice themselves on foreign battlefields, to give up their careers, their families, their own conceptions of the good life for us, we don't think that there needs to be a world in which we can't recognise the brave decision or non-decision they made, but also say that war is hell. In fact, on the contrary, we think that the two work very nicely together. That if we recognise how much we've lost in war, how much, not just as a country, not just nationalistically, but as a world, as a collective, if we look at what we've lost in war, that is how we are best placed to avoid it in future. Two main questions at the heart of this debate. Firstly, what do commemorations actually look like? What is their effect? How do they play out? And secondly, how do those affect the glorification of war? On the first, we had a fairly simplistic characterization of commemorations from the affirmative. Basically, a little like a hop, skip, and a jump, right? So we honour fallen soldiers, and we say they're heroic, and therefore, implicitly, we get glorification. I'll talk about that second link in a moment, but let's talk firstly about this idea of honouring fallen soldiers, talking about their heroism and bravery. We told you that was a bit of an oversimplification, because the reality is that even if we use words like heroism and bravery, a couple of words doesn't create a war culture, right? Anzac Dawn services don't have a monopoly on the way that we discuss or engage with war. Because we told you that there are a few ways in which commemorations are more meaningfully negative than the way that Paul and James wanted to paint them. We talked about the way that they are framed in a very somber manner, the fact that we play sad music, that we sing sad songs and read sad poems. No one ever starts cheering at a dawn service, right? You never hear like huge rounds of applause, people whooping and cheering, like you hopefully will after the speech, right? But people are quite predominantly crying if they're expressing emotions, right? You have young children who wear their grandparents' medals to the service because they couldn't be there to wear them themselves. It's a somber moment, it's a horrific time, and a time for people to regret rather than to celebrate. But what's more, we told you, and they kind of accepted through their narrative, that these commemorations are about individuals. That, yeah, they're not about lofty narratives about why the First World War was fought, but they are about individual people, people who we can empathise with and sympathise with, who looked much like we do, who gave up their hopes and dreams, much like we have hopes and dreams, to go to war, a choice that we would hope never to have to make. They look like our family members, whether they are New Zealanders or Turks, whether they're French or German. They look like us, they have experiences we can empathise with. And that's important because of the second question as to how to fix glorification. Because when they tried to tell you that the heroism of soldiers implicitly and magically leads to a glorification of war, there are two big problems with that. The first is that if we feel tragically about dawn services, about commemorations, then we're unlikely to get those glorifying emotions. Even subversively, right? It's not good enough to just say the word subversive and thus circumvent logic. We think that still emotions, like the ones that are evoked by the ode of remembrance, play out. But when individualism plays in, that's what really changes it. Because when we're thinking about the people who were lost, the people who made heroic sacrifices, the people who had to go through horrific things to survive wars, then no, that's not a celebration of war, but a denigration of it. It says that those people had to throw away their lives for what? And we see nothing, because in popular culture, we do, when we then have discussions about wars, we're able to say, this is what we've lost. And that's why the alternative narrative is important, because when the alternative is not Paul's ripping on the deceased for our dawn services and being like, so let's talk about how shit World War I is, but it's actually a popular media narrative which does glorify war, which is nationalistic and harmful, then we say that compared to that, what commemorations do is make us remember the cost in a world where we otherwise wouldn't. Because it shifts the discourse. It makes us think about the people like us whose lives were irrevocably destroyed by war. It makes us think twice before we turn against our neighbours for bloodshed before we commit to petty capitalistic conquest. That's what we stand for and we're proud of.
It seemed rather frivolous when he said it, but the analogy to Bill Clinton's funeral was quite telling from the opposition. Because we would suggest that Bill Clinton's funeral will be one where there is a celebration and a glorification of that man. The precise reason is because, as they told us, you focus on the positives. The reason why that was fine for their side of the house was because, on a broader level, we can still talk about the negatives in his life. We did not have to prove to you in this debate that people in society, as a result of commemorations, never talk about the negatives of war. We had to prove that the characteristics of the commemorations themselves were to glorify and to celebrate the war and the sacrifice made in those wars. We did that. Two questions. First, what is the narrative and the tone of these commemorations in isolation? And the second is to question what the contribution of the wider narrative is and the interaction of the commemorations with this and the extent to which that is relevant to this debate. On the first of those questions, What we told you on proposition was that commemorations typically focus on the virtuous aspects. We told you the reason they have an inclination to do that is because of the natural emotion that people feel when they hear about loss or when they hear about loss of life. As a result, the commemorations, when they have a large group of people like that, have a tendency to want to flip that around and say, you shouldn't be crying, you shouldn't be sad, because we're celebrating such a great sacrifice, because it was so necessary. The opposition told us first that we owe a duty to respect their bravery, so this is fine. Well, you may owe a duty, but that's not relevant to this debate, because the fact that you're saying you owe that duty and you actualize that duty doesn't disprove the fact that that's a glorification. It may be a justified glorification, but it is still a glorification and a celebration of that war effort. Then Tim at second said, well, it's easy to say that both the individual was right in what they did or was brave in what they did, but there are broader negatives. But their own point contradicted this, because they told you we focus on the individuals in these ceremonies, that's what creates the sadness. Importantly, the focus on the individuals is not on the sadness of the loss of their life, but rather the heroism of the loss of their life. When they talk about things like the fact that wasn't it so sad that they had to lose their family for this war effort, the implicit message of that is that they lost their family in order to serve us, that what they did was a noble and a heroic thing to do. Ultimately, that celebrates it and paints it in a more positive light than our natural inclination to just be sad about the loss of that life. They told you about the wearing of medals. When the child wears their grandfather's medals, they don't think about the fact that wasn't it sad he had to shoot 5 people in order to get those medals, but rather they say, wasn't he such a hero in whatever he did to get these medals? Again, it's painted in a positive light on the whole rather than a negative one, rather than one that regrets the existence of war. Finally, Tim at second speaker wanted to talk a lot about the existence of joint ceremonies and that these simply wouldn't be possible if we were right. The first thing we would say is that these are an outlier, that it's often very rare that these joint ceremonies occur. But the second thing to say here is that the bread and butter underlying all of that, even if there is an inclination on some right-minded politicians to go into joint ceremonies, there are a huge amount of people, and what's underlying that entire ceremony is celebrating the heroism of the people in that war. Regardless of whether it's from another country, you're still celebrating the heroism and glorifying the war effort. To turn to the wider narrative, they told you context is important because the context currently, or absence of commemorations, glorifies war. This was an assertion based on a scene in a film they had seen, and I hadn't. But furthermore, we would say that it's not relevant, as glorification is not a relative term, right? We did not have to prove that that commemorations glorify war than all films do. But what we did tell you on our side of the house is that it's very hard to do the opposite in that wider context. That when you have this commemoration and you're told to be somber and sad about the war, that you are then unable in the wider community to come out and say that war was a terrible and a waste, and that those lives that were lost were an absolute waste. Ultimately, that suppresses the ability to undercut this glorification that may occur in some sectors of the community. Ultimately, their case is one that says, it's sad that war occurred, but we do it all again. That is one that glorifies and celebrates the concept of war we propose.
Thank you very much to both our teams from the Universities of Auckland and Canterbury for a very spirited debate, a debate that made us think. I ask you now to take a seat in the audience. The adjudicators will withdraw to decide on the winner of this debate, and I would like to ask Stephen Franks to join me on the panel. We always have 2 excellent commentators for each debate in our series. Tonight, first commentator in the debate is Stephen Franks, who is a friend of the New Zealand Initiative, a prominent lawyer and former member of Parliament. Welcome, Stephen. The second excellent debater is myself. And Stephen and I, we discussed before this debate in which order we should address you, and Stephen said, depending on how the debate goes, you should go first. Is that still what you want me to do? Great. My take on the debate is that I have lived in 4 different countries, and I have seen very different ways of commemorating wars. I have lived in New Zealand, obviously, now. I've previously lived in Australia. I lived in Britain. And I guess you would have never picked it up from my accent, but I'm German. And I have seen in all 4 countries that it's a very different way of commemorating wars. And I thought it was actually quite a nice thing, actually, to have this German perspective in the debate, And unfortunately, Kim.com couldn't make it tonight. Neither could Angela Merkel. So, what I have observed in these 4 countries, 3 of course part of the empire, it's a very different culture. What I've seen in Britain is that typically when you talk about wars, World War II is still celebrated as Britain's finest hour. When I think of the ways in which war is commemorated in Australia and New Zealand, I think it's really part of becoming a nation in both countries, more so than the Statute of Westminster or Federation. But when I think of Germany, a 40 Towers episode comes to mind, and it's don't mention the war. In Germany, it is a very different story. We're talking about previous wars for good reasons. Because when you talk about the wars in Germany, of course, there's a lot of guilt involved, there's a lot of embarrassment involved, and it's something that you would rather not talk about. At least that's how it felt to me when I grew up in Germany. For good reasons, of course, because Germany fought on the wrong side of history, it fought for the wrong causes, certainly in World War II. And I just want to share a couple of anecdotes really on how war is commemorated in Germany, and then you can actually relate it to your own experiences of how war is commemorated in New Zealand or Australia or Britain. There was a stone outside my grammar school. Just outside the entrance of my grammar school, they discovered a few years ago a big commemorative stone when they cut a few bushes. And that stone had an inscription and it said to honor our heroes and to teach our youth. 1914, 1918, okay, so far so good, 1939, 1945. Ouch. When they discovered that stone, nobody knew what to do with it. So there were 2 factions. One said, well, you have to remove them, that's embarrassing. Nobody can honor our heroes from the Second World War. The other faction of my school said, well, actually, no, you have to keep it there because that's part of our history. And we should certainly honor, maybe not our heroes, but those who gave their lives. And there was a big debate at my school. And what happened was a typical German compromise. The court and the gardeners and planted a few more scrubs. The other anecdotes from commemorating the wars in Germany is from the 1980s. And Ronald Reagan, the then US president, planned a visit to Germany. And it was his wish to visit a cemetery and honor the heroes from both sides. The Germans were uncomfortable about that. But for an American president, it was something normal to do. Whenever an American president visits another country, of course, he goes to a cemetery. The Germans accepted that wish. But then they discovered that at this particular cemetery that Ronald Reagan wished to visit, there were members of the Waffen-SS. And for those familiar with the German army, that was the worst part of the Wehrmacht. That was the worst part, committing the most atrocious acts of war. And so, of course, there was a lot of debate in Germany at the time, can we allow the American president to commemorate the Waffen-SS with the German chancellor? Well, one of the people who protested most loudly at the time was Günter Grass. Günter Grass, of course, a novelist, Nobel Prize winner for literature, said, well, this is unthinkable. You can't commemorate the Waffen-SS. Ronald Reagan did anyway. 25 years later, it turned out that Günter Grass himself was a member of the Waffen-SS when he was 17. And he didn't want to talk about it, because it was embarrassing. But actually, it kind of underlined that it was right for Ronald Reagan to visit the cemetery because these were 17-year-olds. Yes, they were members of the Waffen-SS, but they were kids. They didn't fight for some great ideology, but they were fighting for something that they were forced to fight for. It was evil, of course, but they had no other choice. I think this lesson that I learned actually from my own country, how war was commemorated, or rather not talked about at all, is something else. That it is necessary to have a culture of remembrance, and it's necessary to have a culture of mourning. It took the Germans 60 or 70 years to even talk about their own victims properly, to talk about their own loss of life. Innocent Germans were not all perpetrators, they were not all guilty. And talk about the loss, not just of lives, but of beautiful inner cities. Dresden. Dresden that was bombed by the British towards the end of the war for no reason at all, because it was not really important in the military sense. It was important to have that commemoration. And in contrasting now these different cultures of commemorating wars, I think you have to find a middle ground. You should talk about the war. Don't mention the war is not a good policy. But it's important to commemorate the dead, and to draw a fine line between these commemorations and celebration. And glorification, I think, is not the same as remembrance. I think this is something that is sometimes missed, especially in Australia. I'm always irritated when I go to the National War Memorial in Canberra. And I think sometimes this fine line is actually crossed. When I see replicas of famous battlefields of World War II, when I see replicas of bomber cockpits of World War II, I don't think that's necessary. You can commemorate the dead without actually portraying wars as playgrounds, adventure playgrounds for grown-ups. I would say that wars, even the ones fought for good causes, maybe for just causes, if there's such a thing, are always failures of civilizations, and we shouldn't forget that. So we should also talk about what these wars were fought about, and we heard this in the debate that we were fighting for freedom. Well, maybe you could say this with some justification for World War II, and definitely New Zealand was fighting on the right side of that war. When it comes to World War I, such a justification is much harder to give, because World War I was fought between some monarchies, some parliamentary monarchies, some constitutional monarchies, but the real reasons behind World War I, the real question of war guilt, that's still a matter of debate for historians. We should commemorate not just the people, the lives that were lost in this war. We should commemorate something else, and that something else is what we lost as a culture. Before World War I think we had the first period of globalization, period of free trade, of free movement between countries, where you didn't need passports to travel around Europe. It was a period of prosperity, and that was lost in World War I. This world came to an end in August 1914, and all the catastrophes of the 20th century started there. The rise of fascism, the rise of communism, the Cold War. None of them would have been thinkable without World War I. And I'd just like to quote a little passage from John Maynard Keynes, very few occasions at which I would quote John Maynard Keynes, but in his Economic Consequences of the Peace, he writes about this period before World War I and what we lost. And he writes, "What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their delivery upon his doorstep. But most important of all, he regarded the state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it is aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. The projects and politics of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play the serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice." That was the world we lost in 1914. That is something we should mourn as well as we mourn our dead in all countries. And that is, I think, what we should remember when we commemorate our past wars. Thank you.
When Oliver asked me to do this, to attend again and to speak again, he said, "I understand you're willing to be controversial." And I said, yes. And I do see it as a bit of a responsibility. This is a tournament between universities. And I listened very carefully this time to see whether I could detect a sort of richness, a reflection of the richness of the discussion that ought to be about war. And any dawning glimmer of recognition that the intelligentsia or the elite talk about war and conflict in terms that are totally removed from the way our society's majority express and show an interest. That when we look at popular culture, a good chunk of it, as it always has been, is effectively not that dissimilar from the weight of poetry and dance and music that Maori devoted to war. Or when I went to China in 1976 to try and live on a commune in under Mao Zedong's regime, I was shocked to find that nearly everything that I could find, nearly every postcard, was about some version of struggle and war. Or when I went with my father for the 50th commemoration of the casino campaign, when they took 100 old soldiers, and attended the first ceremony which had been organised by the British Legion and the Canadians and Poles and Indians and New Zealanders, and all of whom had been defeated by a few thousand German paratroopers, some of whom were as young as 16. And that ceremony started, a big bus pulled up, and some old guys got out. My dad was about 80, some old guys got out in red berets, and they came into the cemetery, and one of the organisers bustled up to them and said, "Please go away," because we were standing at the back, not wanting to intrude on all the old soldiers. "Please go away, this is not for you." And the old New Zealand colonel, who was standing near us, went over to them and said, "Come and stand with us." And it was the Germans. A busload of paratroopers had turned up. And the ceremony was, as Tom O'Brien described it, respectful, and it was conventional in the way you'd expect. And then these guys stood around in the cemetery beneath the hills of the casino, and it was recounting cowboys and Indians. And it was exactly the joy and the glory and the excitement that war and fighting has always engendered in young men. And it was in these 80-year-olds. And my wife, who spoke very good German, translated for a few of the Germans, very few of them who didn't speak reasonable English, and that's what they spent the next hour doing. I was over there and you were there, and what date was it, and so on. So they said, and my father said to me later, that it was the best years of his life. And my wife's father, who won a military cross just up the road at Anzio, sitting in the top of a factory chimney, directing fire from his own guns and the guns of the Americans on each side, and probably slaughtered at least 1,000 Germans in 24 hours, wore out their guns. Roddy said they were the best years of his life, and he went on and made his career in the army and retired as colonel of 2-3 SAS regiment. And his father, before that, had a military cross, as did Roddy. And I mention all this just to say that we steep our commemorations in the sacrifice so that we can allow us all to participate, including those of pacifist inclination. But there is another side to war, that it might be so deep in us that it's as foolish for us to not recognise the if we can call it, the attraction of war. It's as foolish for us to try to speak of it all as if it was only dreadful, as it was, say, for the Victorians to suppress talk of sex as if that too was unnatural. War is deeply in our culture, in Maoridom, in our own history, and in our enemies' culture, our former enemies' culture. I was fortunate enough to be in Turkey during their Kanakali celebration, which is their Anzac at a different time of the year. And it's enormous, and they're enormously magnanimous towards Kiwis in it. And this was in Ankara, and they see it as the birth of their nation. When they finally defeated Western powers after hundreds of years of continuing decline and got a leader who gave them pride. I put this point not because I disagree with anything that Oliver said or anything really that either of the other teams said, except I don't think they were disagreeing, because they failed to test the proposition whether there is something reprehensible about nationalistic exercises and glorification. Because I would rather be and have our history than to be a modern Kurd or a modern Yaziri or a Pole or a Czech or indeed anyone who has perhaps not threatened their neighbours but found that their neighbours threatened them and it didn't work. And I say that we run the risk, if we don't understand the attraction of war, that's irrational and hugely destructive and desperate. If we don't understand that there's something deeply enticing about it as well, if we have this trite reaction. I heard I think every speaker condemned the Vietnam War as appalling or in some way shameful. Have they asked the Vietnamese refugees we've got here? At the height of the Vietnam War, there were about 300,000 refugees from Vietnam overseas. Within 2 years of the end of it, there were nearly 4 million, and probably 1 million perished trying to leave Vietnam. And yet for our own internal narrative, our need to stay consistent to a view that we were awful because we went off to fight an American war, we haven't ever tried to reconsider that war. I spent a month going through there on a bicycle and found plenty of people who said the only problem with that war was that we lost. And so I'm a little bit disappointed still that at a university discussion like this, there hasn't been anyone bold enough to challenge the triteness of the approach that says we should be hanging our head in shame if it was nationalistic and celebratory. Thank you.
We now have time for a few questions before the adjudicators will claim the victor of this debate. Who would like to kick it off? Yes, please.
As a 21-year-old, I think the only commemoration service I've ever been to has been for the First and Second World War, but there have been quite a few wars that New Zealand involved itself in since 1945. Why do you think it is that it's not part of New Zealand's narrative, those wars, so much as it has been 1918 and 1939, like the crucible of New Zealand? Why do you think that like modern wars haven't led so much to nationalistic feeling in New Zealand?
I think it has been, again, part of the dominance of an elite view of the unrespectability of war as part of a dominant coalition. I mean, if within the military, there's enormous pride at what we did in Malaysia in actually defeating a communist insurgency. And there's quite a lot of gratitude in Malaysia for it still. But in New Zealand, it was sort of the early one of our counter-terrorist wars, and they were known to be dirty wars, and there's a sort of, you know, we have been reared in a world that wants to believe that you can live by carrots without sticks. We did it's very little known about it, but we played a very big role in defeating the Indonesian attempt to invade Borneo and Konfrontasi. And we did it, New Zealand SAS were deep behind Indonesian lines, basically killing police chiefs and others to tie down huge numbers of Indonesian troops in their own country and to enable the strengthening of Borneo until it became impossible for them to invade. Now, I don't know how many people even know about it. So you're right. I think it's part of the narrow monoculture, if you like, the intellectual monoculture in our academia.
Just one quick point, I think it's also that in those other wars, many of the soldiers who served were volunteers.
Yeah.
The wars post-Second World War, we've got professional armies, so there's a tendency also to see people as having their professional job as opposed to those, you know, who went from civilians to soldiers as well, which I think affects people's sense of that.
Certainly for New Zealand. In Australia, of course, they did still have conscripts in Vietnam. And in the Korean War, it was a lot smaller and our involvement was a lot less. But I think we performed very creditably. And at a popular level, there's been heaps of celebration of the success in stopping the invasion of South Korea. What's that long-running TV program? MASH, was it? Yeah. But within New Zealand, it sort of was a success that wasn't actually supposed to happen according to the dominant political view when I was at university. I spent my time demonstrating against the Vietnam War, and I adhered to the view that we were pawns of US imperialism, and that was pervasive. Those who fought just shut up.
Final question, Nick.
Now it's 100 years since the First World War ended, and there's a lot of politics around New Zealand, around the world about commemorating it's almost 100 years, that we should maybe shift our focus from the commemorations of those who passed, not forget them, but shift the focus on supporting veterans who have returned from wars nowadays.
My father and my grandfather both thought that the people who went along to commemoration ceremonies were losers. And it was only in the last years that they would go, and the same with my wife's father, my father-in-law. I don't think they wanted to be remembered, but they weren't really big on ceremony as a generation, either of them. I've got a feeling that some of this commemorative urge and the money we're spending on it is kind of a little bit like, Oliver might not comment. I was interested in your comment that Britain, you get the sense they think their finest hour was in the past. I wonder if we are starting to reach that position. Certainly, I found as a parliamentarian, we spent, I think, several days debating a bill to pardon the soldiers who were shot for desertion in the First World War. It was called the Soldiers of the Great War Bill. And it was an orgy of congratulation with our magnanimity when none of us knew which were right or wrong. But it was at the same time that we were getting rid of our air defence capacity, and that we had bought a whole lot of glorified jeeps instead of maintaining the size of our own military. So maybe we're getting into commemoration because we're actually losing the confidence to be capable of fighting.
I only have one thing to add. Maybe you've got a comment to make on that one as well. In commemorating these wars, we often focus on the things that we allegedly fought for. Freedom, universal values. And my question that I have with all of that is, where are these values in present-day conflicts? Where are these values when we're dealing with Syria, when we're confronting Russia in expansion, when we're dealing with the regime in Iran, when we're dealing with the regime in North Korea? There's all very well going on about our values and how we defend them in the past. But do we actually stand up for them today? Do we really know what we mean when we said we fought for freedom and common values? And I think that goes in the same direction that you just mentioned.
Yeah. I'm hesitant to be too critical of staying out of wars where we don't know what the outcome's going to be, even if we really do our best. But certainly, the idea that going into war for moralistic reasons as opposed to reasons of national interest has become rather discredited, and even President Obama, I don't think, wants to do any more of that. It's too hard to know where moral causes begin and end, and so you fight for national interests, not national morality, and then you float it later, possibly in morality, except of course where you've got an absolutely wicked opponent. I don't know if there's anyone in this room who worries about the Americans sending drones to target ISIS. I don't see anyone shaking their head. So we still do fight for values there because there's not a lot of national interest in that.
Thank you, Stephen. Please join me in thanking Stephen Franks for his contribution. Can I ask one of the adjudicators to tell us about the outcome of tonight's debate?
Okay, so I have the joy of speaking for Polly, Richard and myself, and the first thing that I think is important to say before we get into the debate is a really big thanks to the New Zealand Initiative and to Oliver for having us along tonight. All of Richard, Polly and myself were in this competition a few too many years ago for us to like to admit, and we appreciate it continues, and long may it continue. It's a really long-standing tradition, so I'd like us to have a round of applause to Another thing that we all agreed on was that this was a really good topic. It's a timely topic, being 100 years after the Great, or the other side would have you believe, sombre war. And also when the world is at a particularly tumultuous time, it was important to talk about these issues. We think that all the debaters engaged well on them. They made historic issues relevant to us today and made us imagine our own experiences and those experiences of others. So we thought it was a perfect topic to set for a scenario like this, and we're very, very impressed. I'm going to talk about quite quickly what adjudicators do in debates, and it's different to what audience members do. and I'm going to talk about the debate itself. So what adjudicators do is we are the people that facilitate that debating is actually itself fundamentally a competition. So you will have sat there in the audience and thought about this with some of your own ideas, and you would have taken into account what was said tonight. You would have thought about it, and you probably come to a conclusion, or at least predicted who you think will win the debate. But we do a slightly different job to you, which is that we essentially evaluate, as I said, a competition, and a competition that is won by persuasion. And you can break that down into various categories. We often talk about manner and matter, manner being the way that you present the arguments, and matter being the arguments that you have yourself. But fundamentally, it is about persuasion, so we do a slightly different job to the audience. We also do a slightly different job to the audience in that we come to this essentially as a level playing field. So this debate wasn't supposed to be unfair for one side or the other. We assess it as if it was fair for both sides. And if there's a slight leaning one way or the other in 90% of the population's view, then that's not important to adjudicators in the debate. We just assess what happened on the day. We assess things like responsiveness, like time spent on arguments, like the level of rhetorical engagement the teams had. And we basically assess it like a level playing field. So one scenario that we often are confronted with as people trying to teach young debaters how to be good debaters is people say to us, we've found the perfect argument, the argument that not knowing what the other team will say will definitely win us the debate on the day. And we always say to those debaters, if you run that argument, you're likely to lose the debate, because you're not starting the debate from the premise that it's a competition, you're starting the debate from the premise that you have an unbeatable side. So that's what adjudicators do. We assess the debate, we write down notes, and we might not agree with the audience, but often, and most of the time, in fact, do. On the debate itself, we thought this debate was very high quality. We thought it was interesting. As I said, we thought it was very accessible. We thought both teams did a really, really good job. There were broadly two questions in the debate, and different people, again, might disagree on the way you split this up, but the teams, I think, did quite a good job of engaging on the reasons and understanding that there were two ways to categorise the arguments they were making. One about what happens at these dawn ceremonies and similar commemorations or celebrations, depending on which team you're on. Another one about the message that sends and how that engages with broader social discourse. On the first question, the affirmative team talked about these ceremonies being about the nation and being about values and people feeling awkward in these scenarios, criticising the war, whereas the negative team tried to paint a picture of these ceremonies being about people and being about remembering and fundamentally being about reminding us of sacrifices made and not necessarily celebrating virtues of people going to war. And on the whole, on that point, we were persuaded by the negative team that these ceremonies were fundamentally about the people and about remembering them. And to the extent that the affirmative team said that you'd feel awkward about criticising people or criticising the war or standing up and saying something against the war at one of these ceremonies, we didn't necessarily mean that therefore meant that the ceremony was fundamentally about values. It was still fundamentally able to be about people. And on the second question about the message, we believed, again, what the negative team was saying about there creating two narratives, about there being a kind of sombre attitude here, a sombre atmosphere that you couldn't get elsewhere that could combat the popular culture. So this debate was decided amongst the three of our adjudicators in a 2-1 split. So one judge went for the affirmative team, 2 judges went to the negative team, so the winning team is Canterbury. And we also have the joy of being able to decide the best speaker of tonight's debate. We also had a very long discussion about this, and we'll probably continue this discussion, especially outside. But again, we had a good chat about it, and the best speaker of this debate is from Auckland, Paul Smith.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the University of Canterbury. Congratulations to Paul. I think we had a really high quality debate. I think he made us think. We'll have enough food for thought for definitely a few glasses of wine and liberals outside later. For now, I would just like to thank both the University of Canterbury and the University of Auckland, and I would like to ask you, join me in thanking them for their contributions.